Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for everyone coming. I'm very honored and excited to have Robert Woodson as our featured speaker today. Before I introduce Mr. Woodson, please know that this event will be the last event of the Bastiat Society of Washington, D.C. As some of you may already know, our sponsor, the American Institute for Economic Research, or AIER, is phasing out the Bastiat Society program and will be ending all Bastiat Society chapters around the world at the end of the year. AIER is phasing in a new program known as the Harwood Salons, which will not have individual chapters and will be run entirely by AIER. It'll be run by AIER out of its headquarters in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. The new Harwood Salons program will be fully effective at the start of the new year, and I think this change actually makes a lot of sense for AIER, and I'm looking forward to it being implemented. If anyone would like more information on this change, I'll be happy to discuss with anyone after today's event. Now for our special featured speaker, Robert Woodson. Mr. Woodson was a leader in the civil rights movement during the 1960s with Martin Luther King Jr. and has been an advocate for an inclusive colorblind society based on moral character since then. He has been an influential leader on issues of poverty alleviation and empowering disadvantaged communities to become agents of their own uplift rather than dependence on government. He has been a frequent advisor to local, state, and federal government officials as well as business and philanthropic organizations over many years, and has been a frequent social commentator in major print and on-air media. Mr. Woodson is the president and founder of the Woodson Center that he established in 1981. In February 2020, he started the 1776 Unites movement to counter the radical 1619 project developed by the New York Times in 2019. For our event today, Mr. Woodson will discuss the politicization of race, ethnicity, and gender, and how this has developed into destructive policies in our institutions known as DEI, the acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He will also explain his ideas on how to resolve the problem of DEI policies and how to restore traditional American values, as he has written in his latest book, A Pathway to American Renewal, Red, White, and Black, just published last month. So we are very privileged to have Mr. Woodson speak to us today. For our discussion, we've scheduled to go until 1:30. Mr. Woodson will speak for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with attendees. So now I'll turn it over to our featured speaker, Mr. Bob Woodson. Bob, over to you.
Good, good afternoon. There's a prayer that I utter each time that I speak, and I commend to you, Lord, give me the strength to tell and pursue the truth, especially when it's inconvenient to me. That Einstein's, so let me just say that just a little background. I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1937 during the Depression. Despite all you're told about how race influenced segregation, I lived in a low-income, blue-collar neighborhood where 98% of the families had a man and a woman raising children. Elderly people could walk safely in their community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. Never heard of gunfire, never heard of children being shot in their cribs the way they are today. So the first thing that I did as a, excuse me, okay. And so so that's my background. But when I was involved as a young civil rights leader in my Philadelphia, later in Westchester, Pennsylvania, the home of Bayard Rustin, I led demonstrations, but I parted company with the civil rights movement on the issue of forced busing for integration. I felt that and believed that the opposite of segregation is desegregation and not integration, and I parted company with the leaders of the movement at that time. Because if you argue that separate is inherently unequal, then you're concluding that anything that is all black is all bad. That the opposite of segregation is desegregation. Pluralism is our goal. Integration is an individual matter. And so that meant that I was going up the down staircase at the time. And therefore, some of my colleagues told me, well, Bob, your position is compatible with the John Birch Society and the KKK. And I said that, well, if Hitler likes classical music, I'm not going to stop liking it. That we should take our positions on principle, not who agrees or disagrees. The second issue that parted company with the movement was we led a demonstration on Wyeth Laboratories, a pharmaceutical company in Westchester, and on the line with janitors, hairdressers, just folks. And after 2 months, and they desegregated and they hired 9 black PhD chemists. And we asked these brothers and sisters to join the movement. They said they got these jobs because they were qualified, not because of the sacrifices of those on the picket lines. And I realized at that moment that there was a huge class divide in the movement. And then this was reinforced by the fact that as soon as we got the Voting Rights Act passed, the civil rights leaders of the time began to run for political office and run these cities. And they were handed the poverty programs to administer to address poverty. And I realized that from that experience with Wyeth Laboratories, that there was a huge bait and switch game going on that continues to this day, where black civil rights leadership use the demographics of low-income blacks in these troubled neighborhoods as the bait, and a switch occurs when the money arrives. That in the past, and so there are people on the left contend that the challenge that we face today in the inner cities of out-of-wedlock births, of violence and crime, unemployment, that this is due to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And therefore, that's what generated 1619. And then, so the civil rights movement was hijacked at that point, and civil rights leaders who were fighting for equal opportunity became race grievance merchants. And then they became politicians. The poverty programs arrived where it created a commodity out of poor people, where 70 cents of all the dollars that are spent on programs to aid the poor goes not to the poor, but those who serve the poor. They ask not which problems are solvable, but which ones is fundable this year. So we created a commodity out of it, and the persons dispensing these funds were the civil rights leaders. And so again, I parted company with the movement and left the movement at that moment and began to work on behalf of low-income people of all races. And that's where I continue today. And so we're in these paths, and I was looking for, so I began to work on behalf. I worked with the farm workers, with Cesar Chavez, helping them to acquire a medical van that could treat farm workers in the field. I worked with the Association of Indians leadership in the takeover Alcatraz. I helped them to get a diesel generator to light up the island. And so, and I worked for low-income whites in Dorchester on rent strikes. So I was very active for low-income people. But I realized then that they needed allies. And so a major shift occurred in my life again. So I went to work for my national organization, the Unitarian Service Committee, a bunch of liberal whites in Boston. And then when I became a national program director, I looked at their budget, and 70 cents of every dollar went not to the poor, but those who serve the poor. So I left and went with the National Urban League thinking, well, black folks are different. The Urban League was even worse. 80% of the money went to professional service providers. And so I saw this class divide acted out. And that's when when Jimmy Carter got elected, that was it. I left the Democratic Party and became an independent. And when I had it happen, I met with Peter Berger. My first conservative was to meet Peter Berger and James Q. Wilson. And they were working for the American Enterprise Institute on a program that would empower intermediary institutions, mediating structures. And I got into this as an activist. I had very little regard for policy because I'm an activist. But then I realized that policies determine the rules of the game, and winners and losers are determined by the rules of the game, not the sex or race of the rulers. And so I got that understanding. But it was my first encounter. I had a debate with James Q. Wilson. I didn't realize he was this luminary, this person. When he was arguing, and this is important, he was arguing that the way you control crime and behavior is increase the cost of crime, and crime will exponentially decline because people will reason that it costs too much. And so when I heard this argument as a practitioner coming from this conservative theorist, I said, well, what you are proposing does not comport with my reality and the people that I serve, because the young people in the inner cities that are engaging in this predatory, self-destructive behavior have no regard for life. So you can't threaten them with something that they're not fear of losing. And so I said that, so what you must do as an alternative is what I started to do, is to work in and among low-income people so that if we look at, and so that to promote agents of their own uplift. So we went into low-income communities. There's a woman named Rachel Warren and her husband Don Warren did some research to find out, where do low-income people turn to in times of trouble? So they went into low-income neighborhoods all over the country, and they determined that the first 7 people that low-income people turn to are friends, family members. There are 7 institutions within the zip code in which they live, the cultural zip code. The 8th one is a professional service provider. So in light of that reality, we deliver services to the institution of last choice of those in need and wonder why we don't get it. And so then I realized that I spent time with the American Enterprise Institute, and what impressed me about the conservatives at the time is their willingness to challenge and argue with a black person. White liberals, no matter what you say, no matter how stupid or crazy, they are not going to argue with me. And so I had to say, but with Peter Berger, we were arguing theory against my practice. And I say, these are people. The other thing that I was impressed with, that I became conservative, is their willingness to be self-critical. Dr. King said that the highest form of maturity is the ability to be self-critical. Well, at the time I came in, John Tower, you remember, he was Reagan's nominee for defense secretary, but he had some moral failings. And Paul Weyrich, the co-founder of Heritage Foundation, testified against John Tower, and he paid a horrific price in the conservative movement among donors for taking this principled position. So I said, so conservatives are people who tolerate debate within, but also they elevate principle above ideology and practice. And so I became familiar with and began to understand that perhaps there is an alliance that we can create between low-income people who are fighting against poverty by looking internal to strategies of social uplift versus those who profit from it. So then I realized that low-income people have strategic interests that are compatible with the low-income people, because conservatives don't profit from having dependent people. If you are a liberal, a friend of mine, John McKnight, had a cabin built in Wisconsin. His carpenter had one leg, and his electrician was a drunk. John says that their value to him was their skill. But if he was a disabilities director, their skill has no significance. And instead, and so then that army, but then I realized when the left is saying that the problems confronting Black America today have to do with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. As a person who was born in 1937, I personally, Woodson, but what we did at the time was we challenged that notion by going back to into history to see what happened to the Black community after slavery. And so in our publications at the Woodson Center, when I established the Woodson Center, it was an institution to represent low-income Josephs, as I call them. And what do I mean by Joseph? How can we compare what the interests of the strategic interests of the poor versus the interests of the rich? And I found that paradigm in Genesis with Joseph. Joseph, as you know, was from a dysfunctional Hebrew family. He was one of 12 children, boys. But he had he was favored by his father. And he had this dream, and that he shared with his siblings and his father, that he could see the future. They would be bowing down to him. He was arrogant. And you know the story. He was sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites in Egypt. And he served in the house of Potiphar, but he became the best servant. And he was a very handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife lusted for him and tried to have a relationship with him, but Joseph refused because he had horizontal integrity and literal horizontal and vertical integrity. It would be a violation of the trust with his master, but also a sin against his God. And you know, he was thrown into jail, falsely accused of attempted rape, and he became the best inmate. And he languished there for many years until he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants there, and they promised to get him out, and they abandoned him. So now he's 31, but still faithful. And Pharaoh had dreams that none of his PhDs or MBAs could answer. And his servant remembered Joseph, who was in the dungeons. And he came before Pharaoh, and they said, bow down to the God Pharaoh. He said, I can't do that because it'd be a violation of sin against my God. So Pharaoh knew he had integrity. And Pharaoh said, there'll be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Save up 20%. His first flat tax. And appoint an overseer. And Joseph was appointed the overseer. Now, the significance of that Pharaoh was important because Pharaoh could dream bad dreams in good time. He was not impressed with his power or his wealth. He was still able to look over the horizon and know something foreboding was coming. But he also did something that we were challenged today. That Pharaoh reached across class, race lines, and ethnicity to empower a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd. And as a consequence, he was placed in charge, and Egypt prevailed. Well, what is the significance for what we're talking about today? The Woodson Center, when we are looking at what are solutions to the problems of violence and crime and whatnot, we go into low-income neighborhoods and we look for the Josephs. There are two types. There are Josephs from the Bible. They're people that are in poverty but not of poverty. If you say that 70% of black families are raising children that are dropping out of school or in jail and drugs, it means 30% are not. But we don't go into the 30% of the households in low-income neighborhoods that are functioning to find out what is the source of their success. Because we're possessed and obsessed with studying pathology. Studying pathology. So we go in. The other type of Joseph that we are seeking are the person who was a prostitute, who was a predator, but through God's grace had become redeemed and transformed. And they, therefore, are powerful witnesses to people that redemption is available to you regardless of what your past has been. And so we, at the Woodson Center, we have established that we are the Josephs. That the problem is addressing poverty, that we generalize. You can't generalize about any group of people. Not everybody is poor for the same reason, so therefore there has to be different remedies for causes. There's some people, category one, are people just broke. They lost their job, their factories moved out of town, there's a death of a significant breadwinner, but their character is intact. And people like that use the welfare system as it was intended, as an ambulance service, not as a transportation system. And they will move on. The second category are people whose character is intact, but that there are perverse incentives, because if they're on welfare of assistance and they get a job, then they'll lose their benefits. If you take away the perverse incentives for being they will be fine. The third category is people that are physically or mentally disabled. We have to find a way to care for them. But the fourth category of people are people who are poor because of a character deficits, the chances that they take and the choices that they make. And therefore, if you just give services or give aid to that group, you injure with the helping hand. Because a prerequisite for helping them has to be a transformation or redemption. And these are the groups that the Woodson Center specializes in. We know how to go into high crime, troubled neighborhoods and find category 4 poor people. And by using Josephs, they are not advocates, they witness to people. People are, a witness is more powerful than an advocate. And so the Woodson Center is able to promote change and transformation within these neighborhoods by going in and identifying these grassroots Josephs and providing them. We're like a venture capitalist without capital. And we apply the principles that operate in our market economy to the social economy. They are often the social entrepreneurs. And they require capital, but they also require training. And so we have been able to demonstrate that the principles of our market economy that the left opposes are essential to the restoration of our urban centers. But also we find that what's essential for transformation and redemption is a religious experience. It is faith-centered. You cannot have redemption without it. And so the Woodson Center has demonstrated by going into these communities over the past 40 years that we have created islands of moral and spiritual and economic excellence by coming in and applying it. And our biggest disappointment is that we have not been able to recruit conservatives into this process And so part of my work with conservatives is helping to understand the reason that we are losing the cultural war is because we don't have a ground game. You're not going to push back against the left by publishing papers, supporting think tanks, and then whining about it on Fox. What you must do is, what I've been trying to do is seek some allegiance, some partnerships with low-income Josephs. So, and because the Josephs that we support, their capacity to redeem and transform their peers is based upon the principles of our founders. It is to pietas, faithfulness, God, country, and love thy neighbor. Those are the three pillars of this nation's founding. And so if we want to convince people that those principles and these virtues have merit and value, we're not going to do it by offering free online courses on the Constitution or issuing a white paper. We're going to do it by demonstrating to the American public that these values, these principles, these virtues have the consequence of transforming people's lives. And then we will be able to bring about transformation in our society. And in the spirit of self-analysis and self-criticism, if conservatives today were fighting the Second World War, an invasion of Normandy, you would have Air Force, Navy, but no Marines and any soldiers. And you would not be supporting insurgents within those countries. And so what the Woodson Center has proposed and what we've demonstrated, that if we come together and bring the resources that the conservative movement has to, in partnership with grassroots activists, the Woodson Center has, as a part of it, 3,000 grassroots leaders of all racial and ethnic groups in 39 states that are all patriots. They are all indigenous to that community where they've demonstrated that they can transform and redeem those communities, but they struggle. So to that end, the Woodson Center is establishing a $50 million Joseph Fund so that we can come with these healing agents, we call them, and provide the kind of money that enable them to close the gap between what they can afford to do versus they're capable of doing. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples of what I'm talking about. There's one of our Josephs in Las Vegas, Nevada. John Ponner's been in and out of jail since he was 14. He came to Christ after he did 7 years in prison. And he dedicated himself to using his experience to entice others. He set up a group called Hope for Prisoners, where he counsels people coming out of prison. In the last 10 years, they have taken 5,000 people come out, only 6% recidivism rate. And 40% of the mentors that they use are police officers who locked up the people that they're now mentoring. That's innovation. And as a consequence, in Las Vegas, Nevada, the negative violent encounters between the police and citizens has dramatically reduced. And now John has established what he's called Opportunity Village, where they have a skills center for building and trade skills center built inside the prison. So inmates in there can become carpenters, electricians, and others. It's so popular that 50 members of the governor's conference staff came for a site visit. The governor yesterday of Nevada said, I'm going to pay you to build one in the northern Nevada. The Joseph Fund would come upon an innovation like this and provide the funds for prisons around this country to create such centers. And another one is a Pineywood School in Jackson, Mississippi, a 115-year-old black boarding school that has been created and been serving black children from the inner cities that are failing public schools. And it's faith-centered, it's Christ-centered. They have mandatory work, mandatory chapel, and the kids come from the worst. Every one of the graduates go on to college. But yet they're from schools like in Boston, in Baltimore, where the kids are only reading at the third grade, only 3% reading at grade level, but 100% graduate. We are raising money. We want to give 10 or 15 million so they can rebuild all of the buildings that have been out there, so they can expand the number of children that they're raising by 3 or 4-fold. And there are other kind of centers of excellence where restoration and redemption is going on from within the most toxic in communities, building on the foundation of our founding principles. And so to me, this is what a conservative agenda would look like that will successfully push back against the assault on our founding principles. It's going to have to be an action agenda, not another white paper. And unfortunately, we have some race grievance mongers on the right as well, that they profit from having this conflict because there's a lot of hate and resentment money out there. But so what we have to be a sensible center coming together in our society to push back. There has been one conservative, two conservatives I can think of. Dick Riordan in 1990 became the first Republican mayor of the city of Los Angeles in 35 years. And what did Dick Riordan do? 2 years before he ran for office, he went into the low-income Hispanic area, East LA, met with Joseph organizations and said, what needs do you have? What are the solutions to the problem that you propose that we can support? And they said they needed a learning center because there's no facilities for the children. So he recruited some of his friends and they built a state-of-the-art Dick Riordan Center in East LA and in South Central. And when Dick ran for office, he was supported by some of the most liberal Democratic activists. And he won and became the first mayor because he planted charitably and harvest politically, but you don't plant and harvest in the same year. And Steve Goldsmith did the same thing. We worked for 6 years with Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis. He did the same thing. He privatized public services, subcontracted with the local churches to run the local parks in the city, who hired teenagers from the city. And they not only maintained the parks, but they also provided safety because the children conferred on the park. They had a sense of ownership of that facility. And Steve Goldsmith reaped the benefit by being reelected a white conservative mayor in a predominantly Democratic city. And so it says to us, in conclusion, that, again, the pushback that conservatism, we must understand that we need allies. And the way we recruit allies is by supporting the principles, in other words, the founders' action, the founding principles in action. The people that the Woodson Center serves are actionable examples of the founding principles. That, to me, is a ground game. We did this with the housing, when Reagan was in office. We were working with a local public housing institution in Washington, D.C. that was among the worst. But the residents said, we are tired of living like this. They threw the drug dealers out. They sent 600 kids in 10 years to college from the public housing development, thus eliminating teen pregnancy. And so there were some conservative, Dick Armey and Newt Gingrich were all freshman congressmen. And they came into that community and conducted hearings. White conservatives came in to ask low-income blacks, what is working in your community? And as a consequence, it was such an anomaly that the local press, it was the lead story. And then the Democratic committee rushed the week after and had hearings. But we worked with that group of resident leaders from around the country, and we asked them, well, what barriers is government placing in your path? And we sat with them and we identified 7 amendments to the Housing Act. And I went to Bill Armstrong, conservative from Colorado, and he sponsored 7 amendments to the Housing Act. He reached across to Alan Dixon, liberal Democrat from Illinois. He co-sponsored it. I brought Jack Kemp together with Walter Fauntroy, the co-sponsor in the House. Now, these are conservative policies, and he co-sponsored, and it was voted 93-0 in the Senate, 430-0 in the House. And we sat with Ronald Reagan, flanked by 6 black residents of public housing, signing those into the law. The housing law had not been modified for 23 years. I thought at that moment that conservatives would see this not as a moment, but as a movement, as a template for how to govern into the future that would respond to the needs of low-income people and, as a consequence, address the issue of race indirectly. But they didn't. Soon as it was successful, they went back to the same policies that had failed before. But I'm hoping and praying now, under this current environment, that the conservative movement would seize this opportunity to embrace this kind of approach now that it's needed in order to propel us. Let me just read from what Samuel Adams said, like, with a real crisis, and as a general dissolution of principles and manners will more surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued, but when they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. If the virtues and knowledge are diffused among the people, they will never be enslaved, and this will be their greatest security. That neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. Any conservative who believes in limited government and smaller government, that I do, then you must support strong mediating institutions, because that's where the poor thrive and prosper. So if you are against big government, then you must be for local institutions. You must be for mediating structures. If you want to witness for yourself an example of that, you can turn on YouTube 60 Minutes, Bertha Gilkey. 60 Minutes, Bertha Gilkey. We work with the producers of 60 Minutes for 2 months to produce this segment. And it shows you how, once you invest in that, how these low-income leaders create such peace and tranquility in that community that market rate housing was built right across the street from public housing. That's how peaceful it became. One quick example of the innovation. They set up their own laundry room with new machines, but under the housing, they said, well, we don't have a security budget, so how are we going to secure it? So they said, well, who's the toughest kid in this environment? Tommy Jones. Oh, we'll make his mother the monitor of the laundry room. She thought that her son was the nicest, sweetest thing around. But grassroots people, because of their knowledge, are able to take innovative interventions that not only are effective, but save money. So let me just stop and take whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
So, yeah, I'd like to start off with one question for Mr. Woodson. So one thing that you touched on a previous event was this sort of attitude that I guess people on the left have, that blacks are incapable of being their own achievers and achieving on their own. And you had talked about blacks who had actually started out as slaves in the 1800s and became millionaires after they were no longer slaves. They became wealthy on their own. And another interesting story you told was about something I think is largely unknown, and that is there was actually at one time a Black Wall Street. And I think those are really interesting stories, and I think it would be nice to...
I'm glad you brought that up, because we have in our books, you know, in order to counter the 1619 project that says that that America is defined by its birth defect of slavery, and therefore that's why we account for the challenge today. Well, we wanted to debunk that lie, and so in our book, our first book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing America from Revisionist History and Race Hustlers, we documented when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. Thomas Sowell and others, every generation after slavery, blacks progressed. At the end of slavery, we had 730 million in assets, 40,000 churches, 40,000 businesses, 800,000 farms. When government was hostile to us and we only 10% could read 20 years after slavery, and within 40 years, 75% of the black community, nowhere in the history of the world, because our churches set up Sabbath schools and started to teach them to read. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver at Calvert hotels in Florida, in Miami, the St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles. We, in 1920 to 1930, we had, we closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940 from 3 years to 6 months, because Booker T. Washington, partnered with Julius Rosenwald to create 5,000 Rosenwald Booker T. schools. Rosenwald put up $4 million, and the black community raised $4.8 million. And so when we were denied access, we had our own capital. The churches, we didn't have insurance, and so we had what we call burial insurance. So when they would put $1 in the plate for the offering, they put $1 toward the burial insurance. A.D. Gaston, Alabama's first black engineer, came to these burial sites in the churches and established a black insurance company that was used to capitalize our businesses. So in one of 10 cities, we have what we call the Black Wall Street. In the Bronzeville section of Chicago, for instance, in 1919, when we were redlined and couldn't get money from banks, there were 731 black-owned businesses. There was $100 million in real estate assets in just that. It was called the Black Bottom in Detroit. Every city, in Harlem, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you talk about that Wall Street being burned down, but they don't tell you that it was rebuilt shortly thereafter. In other words, between 1930 and 1940, when the unemployment rate among whites was 25%, it was 40% for blacks. We had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. The highest marriage rate. We had, at the turn of the century, the highest small business formation rate. That any group's participation in the American economy is not dependent on what government does for you. It's the small business formation rate. A healthy community generates 2.5 businesses per 1,000 people per year. That's what we did. That we had a higher business formation rate. In fact, I say this, there was David Burks did a study of entrepreneurship and what are the characteristics of a successful entrepreneur. And he looked at 5,000 entrepreneurs and he found out that only 3% of people are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of the jobs. But entrepreneurs tend to be C students, not A students. A students come back to universities and teach, C students endow. Because smart people have to have all the answers before they act, and when they act, the opportunity's gone. But C students are able to act in the presence of their doubts and uncertainty and make on. Or as one of my favorite lines from A.D. Gaston, who was Alabama's first black millionaire, he only had a 6th grade education. He said, it's better to say I is rich than I am poor.
So go ahead and take questions from our attendees. Anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
I did not capture a quote all the way. I did not capture a quote that you made, but I think I got part of it, and I want to make sure I get the rest of it. It was give me an example of a witness versus an advocate.
That a witness is more powerful than an advocate.
Can you give me like some examples of that in practice?
What it means that if someone was a drug addict and their life has been transformed, like John Ponder, who used to be in and out of jail, the man who started Hope for Prisoners. John is a witness to the fact that you can start life as a predator, but through God's grace you can be redeemed. And therefore, when he presents himself to young men and young women, and he shares his testimony with them, they can identify with him. They can't say to him, oh, I had a tough childhood. Well, I had it worse than you did. So that's what I mean when you witness to somebody. Because I have seen, we've had all kinds of examples of young people, like that. So a witness is much more powerful. Yes, sir.
Hey, Mr. Woodson. My name is Gregory T. Angelo, and I serve as the president of a nonprofit called New Tolerance Campaign. We call ourselves an action tank, by the way, instead of a think tank.
We're a do tank.
But okay, love it. We're on the same wavelength in the same canoe. I do agree with you that the greater divisions and the actual divisions in our society are more cultural and certainly economic in terms of class. I think the problem is that the view that has taken hold with so much of America is that the divisions are all race-based and that the solution has to be race-based. And that has seeped into corporate boardrooms in corporate America. It's seeped into academia and certainly the media. So I wonder, with that view so entrenched, how can we get out of that and pursue a more class-based way to address inequality in the United States?
The way you withdraw the moral authority from any group is give voice to those who say they represent, to speak for themselves. If I were to I could fill an auditorium with 100 low-income black people who, when you ask them, are you for defund the police, 80% of them will tell you no, we need more police. 64% of them don't believe racial discrimination is the greatest barrier to their prospering. So what we do at the Woodson Center, we have witnesses of the people that the left say they represent. And also, I really think that white guilt is an expression of white supremacy. How dare you think that you have the power to do things for me that I won't do for myself? In fact, I tell you what, I'm gonna share this with you. I have become a certified racial exorcist. So all you guilty white folks, you are absolved from slavery and Jim Crow. In fact, I'm thinking about getting in on a race hustle and charge you $50. And any of you foolish enough to pay it, just step over here to Julia. Okay? No, we got to really have honest, because the biggest crisis we're facing is moral and spiritual that's destroying our children. The biggest source of death of children in Appalachia is prescription drugs. Inner city kids is homicide. Among Silicon Valley, the suicide rate among teens is 6 times the national average. Parents are volunteering to stand in front of railroad crossings because so many kids are jumping in front of freight trains. But we're not going to be able to address this moral and spiritual free fall and come together and save our children if we're divided by race. So what we did at the Woodson Center, we have a group called Voices of Black Mothers United with thousands of moms who lost in homicide. They're supporting the police. We're having events all over the country. One of our groups in Racine, Wisconsin, dropped the murder rate down to 0 because of the cooperative anti-violence. So there are solutions, and when you bring, and we bring these moms together in what we call the Mothers Consortium, where for 3 days, mothers of those 3 groups came together in love to figure out how we can fill that empty hole in the hearts of our children that's causing them to devalue life. If you devalue life, you'll take your own or someone else's. But we're not going to get at that if we have to look at things through the prism of race. But let me quote another of my young friends who framed the issue right, Delano Squires. He said that this whole race narrative is driven by guilty whites who are seeking absolution from crimes they didn't commit, and entitled blacks who are seeking absolution from injustice they never suffered. These are the 2 groups, elitist groups, that are driving this narrative. I'm so sick of seeing all these commentators on CNN who are making an average of $10 million a year tell me how conditions in black communities are. Or Oprah Winfrey coming together with Michelle Obama to talk about income inequality. They haven't touched a doorknob in 10 years. Yes, sir.
Great remarks, Mr. Woodson. Thank you for coming. I remember back in the 1980s, there was much discussion in economically deprived inner city areas of creating economic opportunity zones. I think there's a history there, and it would be interesting because you were involved in those efforts. What worked, what didn't work? Where are we 20, 30 years plus after that discussion?
It really did, and again, it built on what you were saying. In our books, Pathways, I got to do that commercial. Pathways, we talk about 20, 25 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. Some of them were not only the richest blacks, but the richest person during slavery. And so, but those same principles, what we do is to take the principles that operated in the past to apply them to today. And there are areas of economic excellence. I told you, look at the one on C-SPAN. I mean, YouTube. There's an example of an opportunity zone. It may not have been called that at the time, but it uses the same principles of investing with people in those communities that have moral authority and social trust. And once a person's character changes, their characteristic has an advantage. We have 6 young men, for instance, in Norfolk, who were former predators who came to Christ and changed their life. We helped them set up a pizza delivery business. They said, as warm as good as from the hood. And guess what? Because of their reputations, they could deliver pizza peacefully in that community because people were fearful of them. So that's using, once your character changes, then your characteristic has an advantage because you can go in areas that others can't. As long as what the determiner is from once you promote character changes, then that has an economic consequence. It's just a matter of coming together because people are motivated to change and improve when you give them a vision of what's possible and not always reminding them of injuries to be avoided. When Jesus was going to the home of Cyrus to attend to his 13-year-old daughter, you had mourners there, you had people greeting him, say, why are you wasting your time? He said, get all these people away from me. I tell my people, man, you don't need cynics around you. They're the worst people in the world. People who are challenging you, criticism is welcome, cynicism isn't. And so what we do at the Woodson Center, we're saying to the country and to conservatives, you know, we need to stand on our principles, but we also need to invest in those who are using those principles to improve the quality of life. And we do this by witnessing. An example in the gospel, when the servants of John the Baptist came to Jesus and said, are you the one or do we seek another? He didn't say anything. He healed in their presence. He said, go tell them what you saw. That's what a witness does.
Any other questions? Oh, Simon in the back. Oh, okay. Sorry.
So I'm listening to you about what the educational system in Baltimore. I'm thinking, how the hell did we end up in this country handing over the education of our children to the government? And it's the government that you're talking about, where you have all these hustlers in there that profit on generations of people that are dependent upon that government. They don't want to teach the kids. They want to teach, I don't know what the hell they're even teaching these kids today in these schools, in the publicly funded schools. So it seems to me that, yeah, it's great to go after those, people who have reached adulthood and try to convert them and bring them to a more moral life. But how about getting them, the kids, and teaching them right from the start in the proper way? And how about just getting the government the hell out of education, period, and allow it just to be community-based, private-based? This way your kids will get a good education. Everyone wants their kid to have a good education, except the bureaucracy. Teachers' unions seem to fight against things that would actually help the kids. Someone's making a lot of money off of these public schools. There's a lot of people getting rich off of public schools. Anyway, I was just wondering if you have any kind of thoughts.
Well, first of all, even in the public schools, in our history books, there were 5 schools in New York, Baltimore, D.C., Atlanta, and New Orleans. Same circumstance, where the kids were being educated in crumbling buildings, half the budget of white schools. Every one of those black schools that had turned out outscored, out-tested white schools. So people can learn if there's proper competence there. But what we do at the Woodson Center with our Joseph Fund is there's a whole network of small Christian schools in some of the most toxic neighborhoods that are successfully salvaging children educationally. What we want to do with an investment is to provide support for them. We saved one in Chester, Pennsylvania that was around for 80 years, but again, they're in a hostile environment. So we invested in them. We want to be able to take them and bring them together into a consortium so we can create our own network of schools that are successfully applying these principles. There's enough money around, and so we're trying to recruit money into these kind of models. What we need is to model, to lend a lie to the other side who said that you cannot create excellence in these communities.
We're almost up with our time, so we just have time for one more question.
I think this lady have right here.
Go ahead.
I think he wanted someone else.
There's another assignment in the back
Why don't
end.
you give this lady?
Oh, okay. Okay.
You had a question here. Okay, right here. Did you have a question?
Yes. You made the statement. Is everything okay? You made the statement that we don't need another online Constitution course, and I would totally agree with that from where you're coming from. I just wanted to find out, like, in what way do you teach founding principles, the founders' principles, like you talked about Samuel Adams, and how do you transfer that down in this process?
I can take you to these communities. The grassroots Josephs, they are using those principles as the means of redeeming and transferring. They may not articulate them that way. And when you read to them what the founding principles are, and they compare that with what they're doing, they say, aha. And so then, once you do that, it enables them to go out and proselytize for this, to say, it is on the foundation of love of country, love of God, and love of, So in other words, all we do is to point to, we articulate to them, explain to them what they're doing. And once they compare their behavior to what the principles are, they become the strongest verbal advocates for those principles. And so that's how you do it. It is amazing. Okay. They will give you all, and they will interpret it in ways that we don't, that we are not familiar with. But it's, you got to really believe that the biggest barrier, let me just say that the biggest barrier that conservatives have is fundamental elitism. We believe that wisdom has to be conveyed can't be conveyed by untutored people. Let me just say that John C. Scott said that there's two types of knowledge. There's episteme knowledge, or learned knowledge you learn in the classroom, and metis knowledge, that's common sense knowledge, that you can teach someone to maneuver a battleship across, or a steamer across an ocean. But once that captain gets to the port of Baltimore, he turns it over to a harbor master, because that harbor master, so the harbor master has metis knowledge, and the harbor master in New York is not the same as the harbor master in Philly, whatnot. So grassroots Josephs are harbor masters. They have common sense. They know how to motivate people to learn. They know how to promote redemption among people who's living predatory lives. The challenge that we have is to recognize metis knowledge as distinct from episteme knowledge. We tend to invest more in this than we do this.
That was a beautiful analogy. The harbor master is a beautiful analogy.
Harbor master.
Thank you so much, Mr. Woodson.